It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Gar Alperovitz. Gar is an eminent historian and political economist who's held senior office in the US Congress and State Department. But he's best known to many of us as the historian who completely reshaped the debate about the use of nuclear weapons by the United States in 1945. Welcome, Gar. It's a real honor to have you here with us
today. Thank you. Pleased to be with you.
Okay. So we're commemorating this summer, this coming month, we're commemorating the 75th anniversary of the atom bombs being dropped on Japanese cities. That debate, which you did so much to shape, continues. And of course, here in the UK, as I'm sure in many other places, the received wisdom is still that dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the Second World War to an end, and that more than that, doing so saved the lives of many hundreds of thousands of US servicemen who would otherwise have been mired in an endless war, dying in the Far East. Can I ask you, Gar, is this true? Was it necessary to drop the bombs to end the war?
I think it's certainly untrue by virtually every measure we have. One of the most interesting features is that almost all of the top US military leaders, President Eisenhower, for instance, who commanded the assault in Europe, MacArthur, almost all of them are on record saying the use of the atomic bomb was totally unnecessary, and for many of them an outrage against humanity and immoral. These are the military leaders, not the critique from the left or from the liberals.
So that's quite an eye-opener for many people here, I think. So I suppose the question then for us is, well, why did they do it? I think that's the real key to this issue for us. And it was said by Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of War in the Truman administration at the time. He said that dropping the bomb was the MasterCard of US diplomacy towards the Soviet Union, which was, coming out of the war, having lost many civilians and many soldiers, it was coming out as one of the big forces that had really contributed to the end of the war. And you've talked in your early work about these events. I think in mid-60s you published Atomic Diplomacy. So what did you mean by atomic diplomacy, and what did the US hope to achieve with it?
Well, first, let me just underscore this, that, and I can provide you with this material if you'd like, that virtually every top military leader went public after the war, challenging their own president, President Truman, saying it was totally unnecessary. So that's really a starting point and an eye-opener, as you say. MasterCard had two ideas. As the war rolled down to an end in Europe, Germany surrendered on May 8th. The bombs were used on August 8th and 9th. We had asked the Russians to come into the war in Asia. And they said, yes, we'll come in. 3 months, it'd take us that long to move our equipment, our munitions, our troops. We'll be in about August 8th. That's 3 months after the German surrender. Note carefully, the bomb was dropped on August 6th and August 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those dates are not an accident. The MasterCard of diplomacy had two components. One, there are many documents showing that top US political leaders and diplomatic leaders saw the bomb as a MasterCard against the Russians, not only ending the war, which was by that time unnecessary, that it would make them, quote, more manageable. That would be in Europe, the negotiations that came out of the Yalta Conference over particularly how to control Germany, what to do about the division of Germany, what to do about Eastern Europe. All of that was in contention at meetings in Europe, at the Potsdam meetings in July of 1945. And there's no doubt from the diaries of Secretary Stimson, from the private records of scientists who met with the Secretary of State, from many other documents, that American leaders, from President Truman As he said in his diary, the war will end a year earlier. He knew that when the Russians came in. He said, I've got what have come. If the bomb works, he's got the bomb, but he didn't know that yet. If not, when the Russians attacked, as he writes his wife, and oh, I've got what I've come for, the Russians come in, that'll end the war. They knew the war was going to end. The Japanese were on their last legs. They had broken the codes. They were reading all of the messages back and forth. Truman thought of it as a hammer on those boys, meaning the Russians. That is, negotiations over Europe were dependent on how the US, how much power it had. The Russian Red Army was there. The US thought its troops were going back home, but the atomic bomb gave him a new weapon, a lever, a hammer on those boys. And in the Far East, if you could stop the war before the Russians got into Japan, then you could control Japan without the Russians. So those are the two driving forces by this time in 1945, in August of 1945, that bring the US policymakers to their decision.
Mm. You mentioned there that codes had been broken and so on, and that the US was able to listen to Japanese messages and conversations and so on. I've heard it said that the Japanese were willing to surrender, or they wanted to negotiate a surrender, preserving the emperor, but nevertheless they were willing to end the war. Is that the case, as you understand it?
Absolutely. As of April 1945, the bomb was used in August. U.S. intelligence was very clear. The war will end when the Russians attack, simply by the shock of the attack. The only condition will be that they keep their emperor in a titular role, like the Queen of England, with no power, except that they regarded their emperor as a god figure, as well as an imperial monarchy. So that was the only condition that U.S. intelligence thought was necessary as early as April. And of course, the bomb was used in August. And look closely at those dates. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th. The Red Army was expected to attack on August 8th, which it did. Mm. Nagasaki was bombed on August 9th. Those are not accidental dates.
Mm. Mm. So really, if looking at it, we can see that what actually happened after the bombings was that Japan surrendered and was able to keep the emperor, but they were willing to do that already in April without the bombs even being dropped. So that seems a very cynical decision by the US president to drop those bombs when it was unnecessary to end the war.
Yes, they were not ready to surrender as of April. The intelligence in April said they would surrender when the Red Army attacked, which was expected August 8th. And so August 8th, the Red Army did attack, and they did surrender, with the sole condition that the emperor not be removed, be allowed to stay in a titular role.
Yeah. So it was the role of the emperor that was the real sticking point for the Japanese at that time.
And we knew all along that the U.S. Army wanted to keep the emperor. That was not even a question, because it would help in the occupation to control Japan. So that was not a question of substance. That was a tactical maneuver by the U.S. government, by the diplomats who were advising President Truman.
So once the war was finally over, I mean, obviously it was over earlier in Europe. It was over in May, I believe, and then by August it was over in the Far East as well. How did the use of the bomb by the US then shape the post-war world? Did it have the effect that Truman wanted?
Well, it certainly was a powerful force, a dramatic force, but since it was unnecessary and known to be unnecessary by not only the United States military, I have a list of virtually every top military leader went public in the United States. President Eisenhower went public. All the leading generals went public saying this was totally unnecessary, which is quite astounding to imagine that the military leadership, just after the surrender of Japan, saying this was outrageous. And some of the comments are really quite dramatic. What happened, I think, is important, because the Russians understood quite well just what American policymakers were thinking about, as they were saying in their private discussions and in their diaries. They understood too that the war was over, and they saw the bomb as aimed at them as what Secretary of War Stimson called the MasterCard of diplomacy against the Russians. And the Russians understood that as well. So the arms race, the nuclear arms race, began the day Hiroshima was bombed, or probably earlier, because the intelligence sources on both sides knew the bomb was being developed. So it was the beginning of the arms race, the nuclear arms race, and we still face the consequences of that arms race going on today with some 7,000 nuclear weapons around the world, perhaps more. And somehow that's got to be raising the issue, I think, of Hiroshima, and the decision making at that time is more relevant to the current events now. And we've been very lucky for a long time now that we haven't had one of these go off. So it's very important to ponder this period and this decision making, the only use of atomic bombs directly, as a warning about the future, not just simply a historical fact.
Yes, it's remarkable to think that if Truman hadn't gone down the road of use, and then maybe the Soviet Union wouldn't have rushed to get a bomb by 1949 and other countries joining in, and the escalation of the arms race, we might be in a world without the possession of nuclear weapons, if he had pulled back from that decision. So it's a terrible legacy for the world.
There's an interesting, the man who was at least the titular in charge of the bomb was the Secretary of War, a conservative named Henry L. Stimson, a Republican, elderly man, but a very eminent statesman. And after the war and after the bomb's use, he realized what had happened. And he went to the president and to a cabinet meeting saying, look, we've got to approach the Russians to cut this off now, because if we enter an arms race with this weapon, and the quote is, rather ostentatiously on our hip, they will understand what that means, and they will rush to build their own weapons, and we'll be off on the arms race. And he was patted on the head in a kind of funny way and said, thanks very much for your service, and away they went building more bombs.
Disastrous. So at the start, Gar, I said there'd been a long-running debate about your research findings. It's an ongoing discussion in the US, I'm sure, as here. Would you say that in the United States, the truth about the bombings is widely known? And how does the knowledge of those terrible crimes affect US attitudes to war, to nuclear weapons, towards their role in the world?
I wish I could say it's widely known. We've several well-known historians, we've joined together and done a number of broadcasts around this event, the 75th anniversary. There are more and more people who understand this, but there's been an extraordinary right-wing attack on all of this, and I think the dominant view is still that the bomb was necessary. It saved 1 million lives. That misunderstanding, I think that lie, is still about the land. We're doing everything we can. The Smithsonian finally, one of the major U.S. institutions of learning, a great museum, a great cultural center, finally asked one of my colleagues, who's also been writing about this in a different way, to make a broadcast on that. We've been doing broadcasts. We're beginning to open up a broader discussion, certainly at the universities, but there's a very, very strong belief or attempt to believe. People don't want to believe what we now know, that the bomb was used by American leaders when it was known to be unnecessary at the cost of 200,000 almost entirely civilian lives. The people in Hiroshima, it was not a military base, and the young men were off to war. So who was left? The elderly, the children, and the women. It's mostly who were destroyed at Hiroshima. And as one of the top military advisors of the president, the chief of staff, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and simultaneously the chairman of the British-American Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, I wasn't taught to kill women and children. Went public with it against his great friend, President Truman. The military is on record almost unanimously. If you go down to the United States Naval Museum, you'll find a big display and a sign next to the display saying that the Russian attack precipitated the end of the war. The bombings were unnecessary.
Mm.
But that is not the broad public understanding.
Mm. Mm.
Although I think many, many people, younger people, are beginning to come around. And we've been doing a number of attempts to broadcast the lecture about it. There's still a vested interest in believing that this was a good thing to do, and that it was, how could one possibly believe that American leaders would do such a thing?
Mm. Well, let's hope, well, let's not just hope, let's work to ensure that such a thing never happens again. And we do live in very dangerous times, and we're seeing some very dangerous policies being adopted, and new nuclear weapons being developed, and perhaps the development of a new nuclear arms race. So I think certainly from our side, from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, we're going to be doing everything we can to pursue the global abolition of nuclear weapons. And we have many partners in the United States as well as globally. So thank you very much for your words and your insight today, Gar. We've really appreciated them, and they'll be a real fine addition to our exhibition to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the wonderful work you all have been doing.
Thanks. Thank you.